All right, so we are going to start a new study and kind of excited about it. It's the book of Ruth. I remember when I was in school, one of the things that they tortured us with is translations. And so you'd work through it, and I tell you, I have a lot of respect for the people that translate our Bibles. It is a lot of work to do that, and they've done a phenomenal job giving us this beautiful English copy that we can read. It's really a lot to be grateful for. But let's pray, then we're going to start off with the book of Ruth and look at it this evening. So Lord Jesus, we thank you for your word. Lord, what we're convinced of is that, God, you have told a story from Genesis to Revelation. God, in your story, you've made a lot of things very clear about yourself, who you are, and what you're like. And Lord, when we study your word, what we learn about you is just, man, we get this picture of your goodness and your grace. And Lord, we see you moving. And Lord, and Ruth's story is no different. Ruth's story is one of hope. The story of Ruth is one of, Lord, that not only have you desired us to read it, but to be impacted by it. And so Jesus, tonight, what I'm going to ask is that your spirit would speak to us, would open our eyes to see you more clearly tonight. And God, that this study would encourage our hearts. And so, Lord, that's what we're going to ask for. Ask that you would do this work. In your name we do pray. Amen. So we're going to look at the book of Ruth. So we're going to look at the first 7 verses tonight and talk a little bit about this book in the context of the Old Testament, where what it's about. So Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. The names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech's, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, the other one Ruth. After they lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Ruth, in the beginning of the book, it actually gives us a lot of information that's really helpful. The first thing that it does, it talks about the kind of the setting of the book. The setting of the book here in verse 1 is it was in the days when the judges ruled. Who are these judges that are ruling in the context of the book? Well, right before the book of Ruth, if you look back just 1 page, you'll find the book of Judges. Ruth is told in the context of this book of Judges. Now, when specifically some of these events happened, it's really hard to tell. But what we do know, and what the author wants us to know, is that in this sense of this book of Judges that's happening, all the things that are happening in it, this story is being told. This story is happening. And so what we'll find out in this book of Ruth, it's kind of, the book of Judges is kind of, it highlights these really high points in this time of history when these judges would rule Israel. But Ruth, for a moment, it's kind of like taking a breath. It's just pausing. And what it does is it kind of zooms in on one family of one particular group of people that had to wrestle through a lot of really crazy decisions. Now, it's just not a random story. It's something nice. The story of Ruth actually gives a sense of hope to the reader. And so after you've read Judges or you think through it, you're like, man, there is really no hope for us as a people. In the story of Ruth, of one family, of bad decisions, of good decisions, 4 short chapters. And by the end of it, the story of Ruth is kind of standing in this optic where through it, you see God's hand moving, and how he moves, it impacts a nation. Story of Ruth. These judges that are ruling. One of the things about the context of these judges ruling, where do these judges come from and how do they get this power to rule? It's not like in our day like a Supreme Court judge. These rulers were ones that would go out normally in battle. They would lead groups of people to conquer a nation, or they would go and to defend the people against these people that were in rebellion. The story of Judges, before you can even get there, is a story of a promise that God made. God made a promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. Abraham was called out of a group of pagan people out of the Ur of the Chaldees. And as Abraham was called out, God made a promise to him. This is what he said, Genesis 15, verse 7. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. So this essentially nomad man being called by God, I'm going to give you a land and you're going to take possession of it. He would live his entire life and never really take possession of a land. He would live as a nomad, traveling from place to place. But God had made a promise to this man named Abraham. As there's an extended amount of time had happened, the people of Israel, these people that God made a promise to of a land, they'd find themselves in exile in Egypt for hundreds of years. As they'd be in exile and just the oppression that was happening from the Egyptian rulers, as they were going through this, they cried out to God, and God sent them a deliverer. His name was Moses. Moses led them out through God's hand, and there's this beautiful imagery of God saying, with an outstretched arm, I'm going to lead you. And what does Moses do? He literally outstretches his arm. And what you see in the narrative of Exodus is not only when God stretches his arm out, Moses stretches his arm out. It's God working through Moses, staking out his arm, rescuing a group of people, and bringing them to himself. What's the plan with the people? Have them wander around for a little bit? You know, it's not like Chuck E. Cheese where you just dump them off and let the kids go around. The whole idea of rescuing the people was to give them a promise, to fulfill what he promised to them, which was what? I'm going to make you a special people, that through you, all the nations will be blessed. There's somebody going to come in your line that's really important. But I'm also going to give you a piece of property. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know if it's like you, but, you know, you see all the billboards, you know, a place to make home of some sort. Like, you know, when you're buying real estate, like, where is my home? This is kind of like God saying, hey, I've given you a piece of property that this is going to be your home. So they're like, okay. So God tells them what he's going to do. People are like, you know what? We're going to rebel against you. We really don't like this plan, and we're going to worship golden calves because we think it's more fun. So they take all their clothes off. They're running around, doing a bunch of stuff. Moses comes out from the mountain. He's like, what are you doing? And so they get punished for a series of years. So Moses dies, or they can't find his body. He's gone. He's in the mountain. So Joshua takes over. Story of Joshua, he goes through, he's taking the people into the land. Joshua dies, so then what happens next? The land's not fully taken over. You know we're supposed to be here, this is fulfilling the promise. And then you get to the story of the judges. Moses wasn't around, Joshua wasn't around. So Judges chapter 3 says this. They were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which he had given their ancestors through Moses. So God had brought the people into a land, and he was testing them. Will you really live by faith? Will you really do what you're supposed to do? Judges chapter 3, if you continue on reading verse 7, it says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot their Lord, their God, served the Baals or the Baals and the Asheroths. So they come into a land, hundreds of years have gone by. They come into a land, God says, I've given it to you. This is a promise I've given to your ancestor Abraham. And what they do, these Baals and Asheroths, are actually a neighboring religion. They're like, you know, God, we don't know what you're going to do or how you're going to move. So instead what we're going to do is do what we see other people doing. And we're just going to worship the way that they're worshiping. So this story of Ruth is told in this moment when these judges God would raise up. These judges would conquer the people that were invading. They would bring back some land. But then what happened is they would rebel again, and then God would give them over to their enemies. Then they would raise up again. Then they would be given into their enemies. Then God would raise up a judge who would take them back. And it was this kind of like seesaw thing going on through the book of Judges. In the midst of this time is when this story of Ruth takes place. So you're born in Judah. You're this family. Your ancestors were promised a piece of property. Doesn't make a lot of sense what's going on. And on top of all those things, if you look in verse 1, when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Now this is kind of a big deal. They didn't have semi-trucks or roads. They didn't have food banks. They were an agrarian culture. They did everything through farming. So if the land that they're in isn't producing, the land that God promised them, what would be the thinking about it? God's a little upset at us. So where are we going to get our food at? Difficult question. So here they are. They're in this land. And so Ruth is a story not only of details and of choices, but it's a story of God's grace. Here we are in the land that we're supposed to be in. I'm a farmer. I can't get any of the ground to give any crop out. I have a family. There's a lot of choices I got to make. What am I going to do? The idea here is it continues on. So it tells us in the story, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So what is Moab? Where is that? Is it part of this promised land that God gave them? Actually, it's not. It's the place, the land of their enemies. The story of Moab is a story of how it started out was with this story of a man named Lot. Lot, and don't want to go through the whole story. It's kind of graphic. The Bible's R-rated at times. The story is pretty gross. Lot's daughters don't have any kids. Your cultural worth was how many children you could bear. Their city got destroyed by some raining fireballs. They're like, hey, well, let's get dad drunk and have some kids. That way we can preserve our name. That's what they did. So Moab's descendants are from this relationship. Moab, at times, throughout their rivalry with Israel, have always been a kind of poking them. There was a king that actually hired someone to curse them. They were an oppressor of Israel. Judges talks about this in chapter 3, verse 12. It says this, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. So what you see is a people not trusting God, worshiping other gods, not walking by faith at all. They're in a land, their livelihood's based on farming, can't produce any crops. So Ruth, as it zooms in, it looks at this one family. And the question is, what do we do? Now he's heard rumors that in Moab, the place that we're not supposed to go, there's a lot of food. And so as what you see here from verse 1, they went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The dad made a decision. I have 2 kids, I'm really concerned for them. We need to move out. And they make the journey. One of the things about Hebrew and in the Old Testament, that names, for the most part, had a lot of significance. So when they would be somewhere or they would have a moment in history, they would name the place after the moment. So you know what the word Bethlehem means? It means, literally, house of bread. So here's the irony of the story. The story is, in the house of bread, there is no bread. So is that an accident, coincidence? Don't think so. Also in Hebrew, you would name your children after concepts or ideas. Now, we really don't do that in English. We name them after maybe other family members. But in Hebrew, a lot of times they were named after different concepts or ideas. So the dad's name, ironically enough, Elimelech, means my God is king. His wife's name, Naomi, means pleasant. And there's something interesting about his children's name. One of them, Mahlon, means sick, and Chilion means failing. So just kind of looking at the story, slowing down and seeing the narrative, here's the picture. God made a promise to a people. They rebelled against him, didn't want anything to do with him. The story says, we're going to talk about somebody personal and their choices and the details that happen. They're living in the house of bread, but you know what? There is no bread. And there's a story about a man whose name is, my God is my king. And you know what he's going to do? He's going to move to his enemy's plains. What do they do in this enemy place? They worship what? Other gods. I mean, do you see the irony that's already being set in the beginning of the story. When they had their kids, probably more than likely, that's when the famine probably kicked in. Or they were maybe physically weak. We're not really sure. But what we do know is that something drastic happened for my God is my king, and pleasant to say that both of our children's name will be sick and dying, essentially. So they moved to Moab. Another thing about this culture in this time, not only were there farmers for the most part, that the way that you preserved your family line was through your children. And it's kind of a big deal. You know, I know sometimes here in America, we look at, it would be great to have a boy. We can actually pass down the name. But it's kind of a thing. I mean, if you didn't have one, you're like, eh. So a lot of people today, they don't want to even have kids. And that's kind of I don't really know if I want to do all that. But in this culture, your children, especially male children, were a sign of a blessing from the Lord. The culture would be is that you as a father, you would pass down to your firstborn everything. And so being the firstborn and being a male was actually even a bigger thing. And so you as a mom, your joy would be to see male children born that would take on your name. The tragedy of this time, for the most part, is that the infant mortality rate was incredibly high. So if your child made it past the age of 2 and it beat out we don't even know what kind of horrible diseases were back then. If it could beat out the competition and the famines, if it could beat out, think about it, not having any type of modern medicine at all. Why are they sick? What's wrong with them? You know what I mean? You'd be surprised reading history or Greek medicine and where they think things exist in your body. So if you were lucky enough to have a kid and your kid was lucky enough to live this long, there was a sense of a crown. It's a place of rejoicing. We can take on the inheritance of our land and of our people, and our children will have this land, and they will represent our God. So here they are. They had to make a tough decision. So they move out to Moab because they hear it has food. Verse 3, now Elimelech, my God is my king, Naomi's husband, died. And she was left with her 2 sons. So choices that they made, they get to Moab, they're foreigners, they're Israelites, this is their hometown, it's not the place they probably should be. Naomi's like, at least I got my husband, he bears our name. I mean, you got to think also in this time and culture, women didn't go get a job, wasn't what they did. The men did that. He's gone. Don't tell us why, but he's gone. So she's like, well, at least I got my 2 sons. Verse 4. These 2 sons, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And they had lived there about 10 years. So in this culture, what do you want to do? You want to have kids, as many as possible. It's your line, it's your lineage. They don't have any kids, apparently. Verse 5, but both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. The thing about the book of Ruth is that what should strike you right at the beginning of the story is the place where you would expect blessing and fullness and all these things is the exact opposite of what Naomi's experience is. The land that's supposed to provide for them doesn't provide. They go to a foreign land. Their sons, who she would hope one day would marry these Israelite men that would pass on their name, marry Moabite women. She's like, well, at least I got my family. And now all of them are gone. No Social Security, didn't exist. You're a widow and a foreigner in a foreign land, and you're like, what do I do? So the story of Ruth should really kind of grip us. How do choices we make, details of a global story, impact us? So she's here. Then verse 6 happens. When Naomi heard in Moab, so she's listening to other people in Moab talking, news is being spread that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. So you got to think of the gravity of this. 10 years in a home that's not your own, with a family that you hope to pass on a piece of property and a name to worship a God. You're there doing your thing just to survive as a widow. No benefits, nothing, just there you're a widow, trying to make it work. And you hear rumors. Our God, and it's the Lord here, it's Yahweh, it's his name, his personal name. Yahweh provided. What does that mean? Now think about it. You're a widow in the land, you've left the land because it had no food, and you hear that God provided? What's the first thought you're going to think? And what we'll discover in here, Naomi, she actually will change her name to Marr, which means bitter. So she goes from pleasant, leaving out full, and the end of the story she'll say, I came back empty, and I changed my name to bitter. Bitterness. Golly, you'd be mad. I would be mad. Wait a minute. The ground is yielding crops again? What does she equate that to? Yahweh. He's bringing food back. There's a sense of like, man, I'm a little ticked off right now. I don't know what I'm going to do with this because here's the deal. Now that there's food, I had land. I probably don't have land anymore. I had children. I cannot have any more children. I had a husband. Even if I had one now, I wouldn't be able to bear children, so my name wouldn't go on. I think there's a little frustration probably that she's experiencing when she hears it. And of all things, where does she hear it at? In Moab. Just doing her thing. She hears someone talking about, hey, I hear back in Bethlehem, the house of bread, that there's actually bread now. I mean, can you imagine hearing the news for the first time yourself? The weight of that? Feeling that? So what does she do? What's her decision? She's like, well, I got a couple choices. I can stay here and fight it out, not being respected by the people here in a land that's not my own, growing up with stories about how our God, Yahweh, how he provided for us, how he saved us, how he rescued us, how he took us from bondage and he brought us into a land. Maybe I should go back home. It's been 10 years. What would people think about me? What would be my reputation if I go back home? What would happen? At the same time, I'm a little ticked off at God. Now you're going to provide? Now you're going to do this thing? So verse 7, with her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. She's like, it's time to go home. I think it's interesting in the story that when she tells the story, that I think it's not by coincidence that the story of my God is my king, the place that has no bread, they're supposed to be doing this in the time of Judges. I think there's a sense that we can feel of, I know what I should believe about God. I know what I should believe about him, but circumstances tell me different. And I'm struggling with that. I think the way that I think we would describe it or experience it as people is that we would consider some of that control. I think my life is going great. You know why? Because everything is working out the way I think it would work out. Everything is in control. And then there becomes a circumstance. Decision has to be made. An order doesn't come in. Have to make a decision about my family. And at that moment, the thing that fleets away from you is control. I can't control the circumstance. The next phase I know about when you lose control of something or that reality hits you is you start to grasp for it. But it's like grasping for the air. It's trying to grab it, but you really can't grab it. You're trying to get the control back. So what do? You push in harder. You try to put up more walls. You try to start reasoning. You try to get the control back. And then this reality hits you. You never had control in the first place. That everything was happening in some sense outside of the control that you had. And then at that moment, when you hear the news about somebody else prospering, you hear the news of somebody else doing well, you start to get a little mad. I see how it is, God. That's the way it's going to be. So just call me, instead of pleasant, call me bitter, because I'm a little angry. So she went in with having everything at her fingertips: children, a family, a husband, an inheritance. She's in a place, no inheritance, no children, no identity. The thing that happens, and I think in the story of Ruth, the part of it is decisions, good or bad, reality that's before you, things you can control or not control. What does it speak about who God is? The last thing that I had thought about in this story is, how does God work in that sense? And the thing is, it wasn't even Naomi's choice, more than likely. It would have been the patriarch, the father, the husband. So the reality is, she is dealing with somebody else's bad choices. Your name is my God is my king, but you don't really believe that. And because of that, now I'm in a situation because I'm not here, but at least I got my kids while I had them. So not only, in some sense, she could even say, hey, I'm the victim, God. I'm just the wife. It's not even my fault. And I think not only does the sense of control has been lost, I don't really know what to do with my life now. All she knows to do is go back home. And what we'll find out in the story of Ruth is when she gets back home, she doesn't even know if she'll be accepted. And on top of it, when she gets back home, she knows people will mock me. We made a bad decision in our life. I think the things that haunt us the most is when we make a bad decision, we can't live with the reality of the fact of what other people will say about you. It's kind of like a weight. I don't know how to best to describe it. When you make a bad decision and you sin, you make a mistake. One of the hardest things to do, you start blaming other people, you start blaming your circumstances. Well, God, if you weren't putting me in this decision or you gave me this temptation, I would have never done it. You look to push it off as much as possible. But what we're really afraid of is, will they accept me again if I come back in? What will happen when I go back home? Will my wife take me back in? Will I have a place to stay? What will be the consequences of the decisions we've made? And I think the story of Ruth and the story of Naomi is that the way that you press into that is how they do it, is they press into something. They press into the character and the work of God. The idea that I came up with is finishing it with this idea. Naomi had to believe something about going back home. Maybe it was faint. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe she knew she had some family there. I don't know. But there had to be something to spark something in her heart to say, if I go back home, coming back with nothing, what will they say about me? And I think she had to make up her mind and say, it's worth the trip anyway, because I believe something about God. Believe something about who he is. And we see her kind of wrestling with those decisions in the first part of the chapter. The thing about Christianity, the thing about the gospel is the news about what Jesus did for us, and as we explore it more, is that the reason that you're accepted, it wasn't because you made all the right decisions. And it wasn't because you were in control. The story of Christianity is when you had made the wrong decisions and you felt like you were grasping for air and you had no control. The news of what Jesus does for you and it comes to you, it frees you. And the Bible would use language as things like it's a gift or this idea of grace. The idea of grace and the things that we'll see in the rest of Ruth, and Ruth's resolve to stay with her mother-in-law and to move forward in this. Grace is something, when you experience it, grace is something that has to be received. So in the best way I could maybe describe it is, it's something that you don't deserve, a gift. Have you ever felt maybe growing up as a child being disappointed with a gift? Or feeling at some point, well, at Christmas, I really hope to get this, X, Y, and Z. Or the idea is that you kind of in an anticipation, I can't wait to see what so-and-so will get me. that feeling, right? And when you're opening the present. Maybe you've not experienced it, but you've seen that expression on somebody else's face when you give a gift. The power of the gift for that person says this: you have value, that's why I got you this. I mean, think about it. You don't buy gifts for random people sitting on the road. Maybe some of you might do that. But what do you do when you spend your money? You try to budget for. You try to buy gifts for people who you what? Love. You know, when Christmas time comes in our house and thinking that, my wife and I, we think, oh man, okay, we got to get a gift for this person. Some of it's a chore. You're like, we got to do this. Oh, I forgot about this. Quickly, let's go over here real fast on the way to the party. We forgot it and just wrap it up real fast. But the people that you love more, you think about what kind of gift they want. You take time. It takes money. I remember this year, I know my kids are already asking, hey, can I get an early birthday present? Can I get an early Christmas present? But as weird as that sounds is, they say, because of who I am, you should give me a gift, and I'll take mine early on deposit. But even right now, if you were to ask me, Ryan, where are you going to get your kids? And two of them I already know what I want to get them. And what I end up doing? I start looking for it. I start looking for which one I'm going to get. One of them wants a bass guitar, and the crazy one wants drums. So I'm not really sure how that's going to work, but what I've been doing is spending some of my free time that I have looking at drums, looking at bass guitars. And so I happened the other day, I was, the guy Joel that played last Wednesday, I found a bass guitar. And you know what I'm thinking about the bass guitar? I'm talking to Joel, and I'm like, Joel, you know, we're talking about some music stuff, and we're at his shop, and he fixes guitars and stuff, does a great job, and so we're talking about it, and I'm like, Joel, I found this bass. What do you think about it? He's like, Ryan, is it for your son? He's like, does he know how to play? I'm like, no. He's like, listen, this will be okay. You just need to let it go. This will be fine. Here's the deal. I'll tweak it up. I'll get it where the action's right, which is on how far the strings are away from there. And if he doesn't get to play with it, you get rid of it. I was like, you know what? That's a great idea. But here I am preparing for Christmas. I don't even know what month this is. What is it? I think it's September, Drew? I don't know. I can't keep remembering. Why am I planning for Christmas? Because I'm telling you, what I want to do is, he's asked for it, I've heard about it, and what do I want to do? I'm excited when he gets it. And so what I'm saying is this, that part of the story of Christianity is, it's a gift that you have to receive. God says, hey, you know what? You don't have any control. It's an illusion. You've made really bad choices, but you know what I want to do? I want to gift you something. The second thing about grace is something that we can't measure, the depth of the gift. You know, at Christmas time, the stockings, which is basically just to fill their teeth with cavities, and at the same time it's kind of like filler prizes. Sometimes when you get a stocking, you're like, what is this? Where did you even find this? Who makes these products? Like, where does this come from in the world? And you're like, okay, I guess. But there's other gifts that when you get, that actually has significant value. It's something you've been longing for. And when you get the gift, what you can't do is measure it. There's